This is Chapter 1, Section 3. Europe encounters Africa and the Americas, 1450 to 1550. So in the 15th century, Europe became more interested in the rest of the world. And there were a bunch of different factors that contributed to that. And the first was the expanding trade networks. Just summed up, if you controlled trade networks, your country was wealthy, which led to more power for the monarch. So here's what happened. Goods like spices and silks and other luxury goods were in very high demand in Europe for centuries. And during the 12th century, merchants from the Italian city-states took over trade routes in the Mediterranean. And in the process, they established an enormously profitable commercial empire of wealthy merchants, bankers, and textile manufacturers. This control of trade networks brought lots of wealth and power for the merchants in Italy. And it also brought more money for the monarchs, giving them more power in the world. It was because of this money that they were able to support the growth of the arts at the time and sponsor the flourishment of the Renaissance, which is actually another contributing factor to the Age of Exploration. So Renaissance means rebirth. And this particular Renaissance was a rebirth in classical Greek and Roman ideas, heritage, and learning. And it started in Italy in the 15th century and eventually spread to the rest of Europe. And the Renaissance blended all of these classical ideas with more modern ideas. And so we see a lot of new art and architecture, new inventions, and even new ideas in politics. So this increased people's interest in being educated, which in turn increased their interest in the outside world. They wanted to be more worldly and more educated, so they want to go and explore now the outside world. Another contributing factor to the Age of Exploration was new technology. So the Renaissance made people want to go and explore. This new technology made that exploration possible. Things like the magnetic compass created by the Chinese, the caravel, a lightweight, faster ship, and the astrolabe, which was a navigation instrument. You can figure out where you were on a nautical map. And so now with the increased interest in exploration and the technology to make it happen, you're going to start to see European countries actually getting out of Europe and exploring more trade routes, as well as exploring more cultures and things in other countries. So Portugal takes off as the leader in exploration. This guy in the picture here is Prince Henry. He's known as Henry the Navigator. He sent ships out to explore the African coast. And he began trading items with the Africans there. For example, he would bring to the Africans salt, wine, and fish in exchange for ivory and gold. Now, eventually, he would also begin trading humans. The Portuguese were the first Europeans to join in the African slave trade. And Henry justified the slave trade on the idea that these captives were being converted to Christianity. This is a quote from Henry's biography. It says, "In Henry's speak, conversion and enslavement were interchangeable terms," meaning Henry thought slavery was okay because we were creating more Christians. And a lot of people felt that same way at the time, and so that's why the slave trade becomes such a huge thing, not just for Portugal, but for a lot of other countries as well. So let's look at West African society and slavery. there was always some sort of unfree status in West Africa. That sort of status, this idea that there were humans in some form of servitude to another, that idea had existed in West Africa for hundreds of years before the Europeans even arrived in Africa. But these unfree people were typically people paying off a debt. Or if like members of the family needed food, someone would go and work for someone else in order to get that food. They'd work without pay in exchange for food. And in other cases, these unfree people would be the prisoners of war from tribal wars or criminals within their own tribe. But the slaves in West Africa were still always considered to be part of society, and they still maintained some of their own rights. The slave trade, the movement of people for purchase, was established in Africa long before the Europeans arrived as well. This is why I said Portugal was the first to join in the African slave trade, first European country to join in, not that they established the African slave trade. The Portuguese used their slaves on the typically sugar plantations, either on islands off the western coast of Africa or in Portugal. And then later in the mid-1500s, they'll start importing slaves to South America to use them, especially in Brazil. That was the big Portuguese colony. So eventually, Europe is also going to reach the Americas. Here's why. The Portuguese explorers had traveled down the west coast of Africa, around the southern tip, and up the east coast to reach India. India is where all of the silks and the spices were located, and so there was a lot of trade between Europe and India, and the Portuguese had always used that same route, down one side of Africa, around the bottom, and up the other side. And they pretty much controlled that route. And if you challenged Portugal and tried to get in on their trade on that route, it was not going to be good. Also, the land route was also closed by, I believe it was the Mongols had control of the land route to India. So either way, you couldn't get to India without a fight. So a lot of European leaders and explorers decided that they needed to find another way to get to India. They needed a new trade route. And Christopher Columbus was an Italian explorer, and he had gone to the King and Queen of Italy to ask for money to fund his explorations to find another route to India, and they said no, they didn't think it was possible. And then he went to a few other countries, and they all told him no. Eventually he went to Spain's leaders, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. And Queen Isabella really liked her luxury goods from India, especially her silks, and so they were very interested in finding a new route to India. Columbus believed that he could get to Asia by crossing the Atlantic Ocean. He could just sail around the world, and eventually he'd make it back to India. And so Ferdinand and Isabella were willing to finance Columbus on his voyage to the west. His voyages west. So Columbus made 4 voyages in total, looking for trade routes. And then in later voyages, he was looking for gold in the Americas and to bring Christianity to the people of Asia. Columbus did not know that when he did land in the West Indies, in the islands in the Caribbean, that he had essentially found a new continent. He believed that he was just in some islands west of India, which is why he named them the West Indies. And he called the people on those islands Indians. But essentially, he discovered new lands that Europe had not really heard about before. So then Columbus would go back and forth to Europe a few times and come back to the West Indies, and he brought with him men and domestic animals. And he'd also bring slaves to the West Indies. And he wanted to begin colonization. Now, it's important to note that Columbus was not the first person who discovered the Americas. Obviously, the natives were already living there. There's also evidence that Africans had explored in South America, and Vikings had explored in like the Canadian region. They even had set up trading posts with the Native Americans. But Columbus gets the credit for being the first European to discover the Americas because he's the only one that actually had a lasting impact. These others explored and then they went home, or they explored and set up trading posts, traded for a little while, and then went home. This Columbus, in his explorations, he actually wanted to encourage colonization and settlement, and so that's why he's given the credit. The American continents, though, were not named after Columbus. They were named later after an Italian merchant and cartographer named Amerigo Vespucci. He had traveled to South America, and he called it Nuevo Mundo when he wrote, or when he created his maps of the region. And Nuevo Mundo in Portuguese means New World, and so it became known as the New World, and later America after him. All right, conflict between Spain and Portugal. Portugal and Spain were headed towards war over exploration and new territories and what belonged to whom. So the Pope sat down and arranged a treaty between the two nations. And if you remember, the Pope, like I said, has a lot of authority at this time. And so the nations of Europe listen to what he has to say and do what he has to say. So the treaty that he arranged was called the Treaty of Tordesillas. And it established something called the line of demarcation. And on the map you can see it's the orange line. According to this treaty, Spain would be allowed to explore everything west of this line, and Portugal would be allowed to explore everything east of this line. The significance, the reason this is important, is because it gave Spain most of the lands to be acquired. Now, in all fairness, no one knew how large the Americas were at the time, and no one knew that they were giving Spain the advantage, but that's just what happened. East of this line, there was a lot more land than west of this line that had not already been explored and claimed. So this is really where Spain takes off as the leader of exploration in the Americas. And Portugal, we're not going to really hear from too much after this. They had already settled in Brazil, and then after that they don't really settle too many other colonies because they're not allowed to anymore. So Spain kind of takes over as the leader in settlement and exploration in the New World at that point. So let's look at the Spanish conquest. Spanish conquerors were known as conquistadors, and they were very brutal in their treatment of Native Americans, as was Christopher Columbus. Hernan Cortez is an example of one of these conquistadors, and he was able to bring down the very powerful Aztec Empire in Mexico. He had superior weapons, and the natives there were weakened by European diseases, and so he also had the help of other native tribes. If you remember, the Aztecs were very aggressive, and so a lot of other native tribes in central Mexico were their enemies, and they were they were willing to help Cortez take over the Aztecs. Francisco Pizarro is another example of a conquistador. He conquered the Inca Empire in South America, in Peru. There, the natives were weakened by European diseases, just like in Mexico. And they were having internal issues. There was a war of succession going on between the previous leader's sons. So they were weakened and easily taken over. So after the conquistadors had pretty much made their claims to these areas, they established something called the Columbian Exchange. The Columbian Exchange is a meeting of the Western and Eastern hemispheres, the Old World and the New World. And they exchanged, it was basically like a trade, and they exchanged animals, plants, food, ideas, and unfortunately diseases between the two hemispheres. The most important of all of this was the disease that traveled from the Eastern Hemisphere to the Western Hemisphere, because those European diseases were extremely destructive to the native populations. They had not built up an immunity to these diseases because they had never been exposed to them before. So it killed somewhere between 50 to 90% of the population of some native tribes. If the natives survived the disease and the conquistadors, they were only subject to forced conversions. They were subject to losing their cultural identity by being forced into a Christian baptism. And they were threatened with death if they did not abandon their native beliefs and convert to Christianity. So either way, colonization was very destructive to the native population. So let's look at Spanish colonization itself. Besides the actual conquering of these nations, what did it look like when Spain established colonies? So Spanish migrants began to settle in Mesoamerica and South America. And once the conquistadors had overthrown the Native American leaders, Spanish monarchs rewarded them with what's called encomiendas, or large land grants. And as part of the encomienda, they got the land, and also they included the Native American tradition of tribute, which is the right to demand free labor and goods from the native communities. Discoveries of gold and silver in some areas increased the value of these land grants at very little cost to the Spaniards. And they utilized the pre-existing Midas system that made Indian workers available to work in the mines. So because of this, the Spanish Empire became fabulously wealthy. Silver shipped to China was minted into coins in exchange for silks, spices, and ceramics. And gold was transported to Europe, and it flowed into the counting houses of Spain, and it embellished the Catholic churches of Europe. Between 1500 and 1650, at least 350,000 Spaniards migrated to Mesoamerica and South America. Also, 250,000 to 300,000 Africans arrived involuntarily as slaves. More than 75% of the Spanish settlers were men, which just shows us they want, basically at this point, not necessarily to make a lasting colony of people who are going to live there. They're just looking to find gold and convert souls and get rich. But it also led to, the fact that most of them were men also led to the development of a substantial mixed race population. Mestizos, for example, were Spanish and Indian. Mulattoes were Spanish and African. And Zombos were Indian and African. And because of this, it contributed to the drafting of legal codes that differentiated among this increasingly complex racial categories. So mulattoes might have had different rights as mestizos, and zombos might have had different rights than the other two. So they had legal codes for each of the different races. The Spanish also set up a bureaucracy, which is an organized system to enforce rules and keep order. And they usually had pretty standardized procedures, just like any other bureaucracy that existed at the time. But they issued laws and implemented taxes in these Spanish colonies. And so that's what Spanish colonization looked like in the very beginning. In the next couple of chapters, we're also going to look at English and French colonization and see how much different they were than the Spanish colonization.